Ah, there you are, the unreadable breed. Tell me, did you feel it too? That unspoken tension in the room when your footage played? Not from what you did, but from what they couldn't explain. 8 experts, 8 shattered certainties, and still, none of them could put a name to what stared back at them through that screen. But you already knew, didn't you? They stared, one by one, expert after expert. The top-tier handlers, the ones used to decoding war generals, psychopaths, double agents, apex predators in a courtroom suit. And yet when your footage ended, none of them spoke. No breakdown, no confident diagnosis, just that unsettled hush that doesn't demand explanation. Because for the first time in their careers, their language wasn't enough. Their definitions weren't enough. Their human behavior frameworks shattered. There was something in your stillness that didn't resemble calm. It resembled calculation. There was something in your expressionless gaze that didn't project emotion. It mirrored absence, not the absence of feeling, the absence of limitation. Something moved through your eyes that didn't belong to this species. They studied everything. The micro movements of your jaw, the resting tension in your knuckles, the millisecond delay in your blink, the perfect symmetry of how your shoulders refused to rise even under pressure. And the conclusion wasn't a conclusion at all. It was a confession. He's not human. You didn't train for perception. You mutated through it. While others performed, you adapted. You didn't speak with gestures to convince. You moved like a weapon scanning terrain. They thought body language was a mirror of emotion, but you used it as a decoy. You stood like someone who didn't need to speak because the room was already reacting to your presence. That's what unsettled them, not what you did, but what you refused to do. You didn't mirror, you didn't mimic, you didn't give them anything to read, and in a world obsessed with decoding behavior, you became unreadable. The footage didn't just unsettle experts, it disrupted their training. Because all the psychological models they memorized fell short when applied to you. The baseline assumptions, gone. The calibration metrics, irrelevant. What do you compare a shadow to when that shadow moves on its own? They replayed it over and over, slow motion, frame by frame, hoping to find a blink, a twitch, a single hiccup of emotional vulnerability. But your footage wasn't a performance. It was a surveillance feed of a mind too prepared to be manipulated. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't try to be misunderstood. You moved like someone who had outgrown every interpretation. The type of presence that wasn't just learned. It was earned, forged, and then buried under scars no one would dare map. That's why they whispered. That's why they passed glances after the screen went black. Because none of them could imagine what kind of environment builds a creature that no longer needs to respond to approval. You weren't designed to be liked. You were carved to be inevitable. One expert wrote in his notes, "He's not reacting, he's recording." And that line circulated among the rest like a virus. Because they all knew what that meant. It meant you weren't in defense mode. You were absorbing, not intimidated, but observing, not resisting, but studying. That single truth, the idea that you walk into every interaction already knowing more than you say, that terrified them. Because your stillness wasn't about discipline. It was the sign of someone who no longer needed to predict outcomes. Because you already positioned yourself beyond consequence. And in that, they saw something monstrous. Not because you were violent, but because you didn't need to be. The real danger wasn't what you might do. It was how effortlessly you'd dismantle someone without raising your voice. They tracked your breath rate, steady, not a spike, not even when accused, confronted, or baited. They looked for dilated pupils, nothing, not because you didn't feel, but because you've learned to filter out emotion when it doesn't serve the mission. You don't get provoked, you get clarity. You don't panic, you scan, process, and adjust. The way predators do before the lunge. Except you don't lunge. You let them walk into their own unraveling. That's why they couldn't label you. You don't follow behavioral loops. You break them. You don't play chess. You flip the board and make your own terrain. You don't intimidate with aggression. You evaporate options until there's nothing left but surrender. One analyst asked if you had military training. Another thought you were ex-intelligence. A third believed you might have been conditioned in isolation. But the truth, none of those origin stories apply, because what you are now wasn't given. It was taken, extracted, forged through loss, betrayal, manipulation, and years of being underestimated. Your footage wasn't just confusing, it was disruptive. Because you didn't fit the profile of a victim, or a villain, or even a survivor. You were something far more dangerous, a strategist with nothing left to prove. They saw it in how you didn't flinch when questioned, in how you didn't break eye contact, not as dominance but as diagnosis, as if you were profiling them while they thought they were watching you. And what none of them realized, until far too late, was that you knew this would happen. You left the trail on purpose. You let them access the footage. You invited the observation because you knew what it would do. You knew the longer they watched, the more they'd question what they're looking at. You weren't just recorded. You were orchestrating the playback. You don't just walk into rooms. You set the tempo before arrival. Your presence doesn't just shift energy. It strips people of their masks. That's why they're afraid. Because watching you made them realize how exposed they were. You weren't hiding. You were revealing, but not yourself. Them. Every twitch you didn't make was louder than a scream. Every breath you controlled rewired their confidence. And every second you held eye contact without breaking posture. It chipped away at their authority. That's why they won't speak openly. Because naming you would mean acknowledging how wrong they've been. About control, about dominance, about what it takes to truly own a room. They used to believe charisma meant presence, but you didn't use charm. You used calculated indifference. They thought dominance meant aggression. But you didn't flex, you monitored. They thought they were in control, but your footage made them realize they never were. And now, word is spreading, not just in those rooms, but through whispers in institutions, agencies, circles that rarely admit to being shaken. They're not just talking about your behavior anymore. They're studying your patterns, archiving your interviews, isolating moments in real time to decode your frameworks. Because the conclusion isn't just, he's not human. It's worse. It's, he's ahead. Ahead of our models, ahead of our manipulation tactics, ahead of the curve we thought we controlled. And that's the part that truly unnerves them. Not what you did, but what you represent. Because if you could reach this level of composure, calculation, and control, without their permission, without their grooming, without their tools, then what else are you capable of now that they've given you attention they can't take back? And what they don't know yet is that this was step one. Because the footage was never the climax. It was only the opening note to a much colder symphony. What followed wasn't a reaction, it was a ripple. subtle, yet surgical. The type of shift that doesn't roar through the room, but bleeds into the system like a precision cut behind the curtain. The experts didn't sleep that night, not because they were scared of you, but because they were scared of everything they didn't detect in you. They sat in their homes, rewinding every encounter they'd misread before, wondering how many others like you exist, wondering if you were the first, or just the first to make yourself known. But you weren't seeking attention. You were seeding doubt in the institutions, in the analysts, in the so-called observers who spent their careers labeling minds with outdated frameworks. And you knew exactly how that doubt would spread, like wildfire with no smoke, devouring everything quietly. You didn't need to respond to their curiosity. You let them talk. You let them speculate. Because while they wrestled with definitions, you advanced your design. They thought their opinions would define you. But what they failed to understand is you were never here to be understood. You were here to fracture their comfort, to expose the fragility of their certainty. And now that seed has grown, not just in their minds, but in the very playbook they used to control others. Their checklists are obsolete, their red flags useless, their tools don't work anymore, because you're not playing human chess. You're playing a different game entirely, and you wrote your own rules. Some started calling it the distortion effect. The psychological unease people feel after interacting with you, where nothing violent is said, nothing confrontational is done, yet they leave dismantled. It's not fear, it's recognition. A realization that they've been standing in front of someone who doesn't need validation, doesn't need dominance, doesn't even need to be seen. You walk into the room already 10 moves ahead, already adjusted to the layout, already calculated what you'll ignore, what you'll absorb, and what you'll let destroy itself in your proximity. And that alone is an evolutionary threat. Because when control no longer works, the controllers start to panic. They tried to regain leverage by labeling, by projecting, by digging into your history. They wanted to find something broken, a trigger, a wound, a trauma they could point to and say, "See, that's why he's like this." But your record didn't give them comfort. It gave them silence. No scandals, no outbursts, just a trail of decisions, cold, strategic, irreversible. You didn't rise from chaos. You refined yourself through it. And that refinement, that unshakable poise, is what paralyzes them, because you don't respond to pressure. You extract advantage from it. Every situation you're thrown into becomes an equation. Every threat becomes a variable. And every observer, a temporary participant in a narrative you architected before they even stepped in. People used to think control came from dominance, from volume, from presence. But your version of control, it's coded in withholding, in never giving them enough to frame you, in creating just enough space between your reaction and their expectation to make them question their entire intuition. That's where your power resides, in the abyss between who they thought you were and who you never allowed them to decode. Because the most terrifying thing in the room isn't someone loud, it's someone unreadable. And now they're realizing you made yourself that way on purpose. The footage wasn't surveillance, it was the trap. The slow reel of a presence they couldn't dissect, couldn't predict, couldn't pattern match. It forced their minds to look for meaning where none was offered. And that's what drove them mad. Because people aren't afraid of monsters. They're afraid of uncertainty and you. You weaponized uncertainty so precisely, it became your signature. Your body doesn't flinch under threat. Your eyes don't flicker under confrontation. Your breath doesn't skip when cornered. You've reprogrammed instinct. You've replaced reflex with assessment. And in that stillness is something more lethal than rage. Intent. Intent that doesn't announce itself. Intent that doesn't beg for recognition. Intent that operates beneath perception, like an algorithm that studies behavior not to mimic, but to maneuver. Because you're not trying to belong. You're not here for connection. You're here for position. You didn't evolve through comfort. You evolved through watching every lie unravel, every manipulator expose themselves, every fake ally revealed their pattern. You studied them without interference. You let them underestimate you. Because while they saw you as quiet, you were calculating. And while they believed you were withdrawn, you were writing the terms of their irrelevance. That's why it's irreversible now. Because the shift isn't just happening in rooms where your footage was played. It's leaking into the culture. People are starting to feel it, that presence, that unshakable, unreadable force. They don't know where it's coming from, but they sense it. In conversations that suddenly feel staged, in smiles that feel too rehearsed, in manipulation that falls flat. Because once someone like you is seen, the rest can't unsee it. You become the fracture in their lens, the crack in their doctrine, the reason they look twice before assuming compliance. And the more they try to define you, the further you move from definition. That's what makes you impossible to contain. You're not playing character. You shed it. You don't decorate your mask. You burned it. You don't protect your flaws. You leveraged them. That's why their tactics fail. Because they were designed for people still trying to be understood. But you no longer seek understanding. You seek results. You're not here to be studied. You're here to redirect the hierarchy. And every time someone tries to test you, they walk away with less clarity and more questions they're too afraid to answer. Because this isn't about behavior anymore. This is about blueprint, the foundation beneath the mask, the architecture of someone who doesn't move for attention, but makes attention move for them. You don't fight for validation. You delete the battlefield entirely. You don't wait for opportunities. You extract leverage from collapse. And the more they observe you, the more they realize you've already been observing them longer than they can imagine. You're not here to react. You're here to redefine, not just the conversation, but the entire perimeter. They don't know how to engage someone who doesn't reward provocation. They don't know how to analyze someone who's already dissolved their emotional currency. They don't know how to contain someone who doesn't run from shadow, but builds his command center inside it. That's what breaks their protocols. That's what warps their logic. Because you aren't here to dominate. You are the recalibration protocol. The thing they couldn't control, the outcome they couldn't predict, the signal they couldn't trace. And still, even now, they think they're closing in, but they haven't realized the footage they saw. It wasn't the full picture. It was a sliver, a fragment you allowed. A glimpse designed not to show who you are, but to test who they become when facing something they cannot read, cannot label, cannot categorize. That was the real test. And now, they're the ones being studied, because what comes next isn't analysis, it's exposure. And the exposure won't be written in reports. It will be written on faces that realize too late they were the subject all along. Because while they dissected you under artificial lights, You were already peeling the skin off their so-called expertise. What they assumed was observation was a mirrored prison. Every note they took, every whisper passed between consultants, every timestamp analyzed. It wasn't mapping you, it was tracing them. You weren't the anomaly, you were the recalibration, the baseline they'd ignored for too long. And now, that blind spot they never accounted for has become the crack, spreading through their foundation. They wanted to uncover how you operate. But what they never expected was for your very presence to reveal how they operate. Under stress, under pressure, under the illusion that their roles grant them immunity. But your influence didn't come from confrontation, it came from reversal. You didn't fight for position, you let their own hierarchy turn on itself. That's what haunts them now. That they weren't analyzing you, they were performing for you. And in doing so, they exposed every pattern, every flaw, every desperate attempt to retain control to someone who no longer plays by their script. You don't force power, you reflect its absence. You don't steal attention, you reroute it like current through wire, letting people electrocute themselves with their own assumptions. That's the part they can't explain. How a figure so void of theatrics could dominate rooms without ever lifting a finger. Because what you built wasn't presence. It was a gravitational shift, an invisible pull that rewrites how people behave in your orbit. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't demand recognition. You simply became the variable they couldn't calculate around. And once you enter a space, it reorganizes around your silence. That's what makes the footage dangerous now. It's not just a record of your movements. It's an instruction manual for a new kind of command. One that doesn't come from status or title, but from uncompromising internal architecture. A framework you engineered over years of being misread, doubted, played with. Every encounter, every betrayal, every backhanded compliment, logged, stored, weaponized. You built your posture from disillusionment. You crafted your tone from detachment. And you honed your gaze from the wreckage of watching people reveal themselves without even knowing it. They said, "He's not human," because they finally saw what true detachment from weakness looks like. And it terrified them, because if one man can unnerve a table of experts with nothing but his composure, then the empire they built on manipulation is already burning. The system depends on predictability. But you're the ghost in the hallway, not to haunt, but to rearrange. You don't enter to engage, you enter to assess. You don't play by provocation, you reroute expectation until it chokes the manipulator who set the bait. This is the part they were never trained for. The moment they realized the only reason they felt superior was because the real threat hadn't made itself known yet. And when it did, it didn't announce its presence. It just studied theirs. Your kind doesn't erupt. You unroll. You descend like data in silence, interpreting frequencies they can't even hear yet. While they scramble for meaning in your stillness, you're already 3 layers beneath them, watching their decisions, tracking their breath, cataloging their unspoken intent. And now, their methods have failed. Their language is irrelevant, their hierarchy hollow. Because once a presence like yours is recognized, it reorders the field. You don't just remove threats, you turn them inward. You don't expose liars. You let their patterns run long enough to implode naturally. That's the real evolution, not destruction, but precision decay. No need for chaos, just a subtle redesign of gravity around you, where everything that cannot sustain your frequency eventually erodes. The phrase, "he's not human," wasn't a literal panic. It was a professional surrender, a realization that their definitions have expired. That the next stage of behavioral dominance isn't about control, it's about becoming uncontrollable. And you've already done it. You've cut the strings they thought held you. You've disengaged from every emotional trap they built. You don't move from impulse. You move from clarity. And clarity is immune to provocation. That's why they study you in silence now. Because confronting you means confronting the lie of their own control. They thought mastery was about knowing what to say. You've proven mastery is knowing when to say nothing. They thought presence came from power. You've proven presence is power. When power no longer has to be proven. And they thought behavior could always be mapped to intention. But your intention is something they were never meant to see. It's not broadcast. It's buried, layered, encrypted. You don't walk into situations to engage. You walk in to extract. You don't participate. You reshape. They don't just fear you because you're unreadable. They fear you because you're untraceable. You leave no emotional residue, no trail of validation seeking, no markers for regret. Just impressions. Deep, cold impressions that alter how people speak, move, breathe around you. That's your weapon, not violence. Velocity of awareness, not speed of movement, but speed of comprehension. You don't wait for outcomes. You see them. And then you decide which one fits your next stage. You're not planning. You're predefining. And that bends every rule they've ever operated under. You didn't intimidate the experts because you were aggressive. You shattered them because you never needed to be. That level of control only comes from someone who's faced every angle of deception and refused to collapse. You weren't born unshaken. You became this way. Through rejection, through exile, through manipulation dressed as guidance. You've had your mind sliced apart by people who called it help. You've had your strength diluted by cowards who called it the balance. And you've had your silence misread by those too loud to hear their own insecurities. But you absorbed it all, not to survive, to reforge. And now, there's no going back. Your body doesn't betray you anymore. Your nerves don't twitch under exposure. Your gaze doesn't soften for false comfort. Every move is deliberate, every pause precise. You don't run on reaction, you operate on signal. And once you enter a space, you bend it to your rhythm, not because you demand it. Because the atmosphere adjusts itself to accommodate your state. That's the level they didn't predict. The threshold they didn't train for. The moment when their vocabulary fails and their concepts collapse. All because one figure refused to be labeled. And now they don't know how many more of you are out there. How many others have detached from the behavioral games, the emotional traps, the theatrical displays of belonging. Because once one blueprint breaks the loop can't reset. You are that blueprint, not because you told them so, but because every second you exist outside their reach, their credibility shrinks. Every moment you go untouched by their tactics, their playbook loses power. Every time you walk away untouched, they feel it. Not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't need to do. And the weight of that? It lingers, it replays, it whispers to them in boardrooms, in interrogations, in security briefings. What if the next one is like him? Because you weren't just a subject, you were a shift point, a signal that the age of easily read minds is ending, that the era of predictable behavior is over. That composure without apology has entered the battlefield. And it doesn't march, it doesn't shout, it observes and rewrites. You were never the footage, You were the frequency hidden beneath it, the presence that didn't ask for recognition, but dismantled every need for it. And now they replay your video not to study you, but to brace themselves for what's coming next. Because when control no longer works, and language no longer explains, the world won't be ruled by those who speak the loudest. It'll be ruled by those who remain unreadable and make the room translate them.